Thanks for being with us and for subscribing to our channel. We are very happy to have Richard Baldwin with us from IMD. Hi, Richard.
Hi.
Hi, good to see you. And Richard will tell us about the big shift going on in globalization. So we're very excited to learn more about these big changes we will experience we're already experiencing and we will experience in the next few years. So let me start with some opening remarks. So if you look back on globalization, of course, globalization really took off in the late 1970s, early 80s. And one way to see it, it was very much focused on manufacturing, on goods trade. It was essentially a sell-off of technology or know-how. So there was, of course, the emphasis on cost efficiency to outsource, essentially in exchange of passing on the know-how and technology to emerging economies. So the Chinese strategy or the emerging economy strategy was essentially to be very strategic and have some strategic industrial policy, trade policy, and FDI policies, while the West was behaving more like a competitive way of thinking, focusing on comparative advantages and so forth. And for each firm in the advanced economies was essentially in a dilemma. If I don't sell off cheaply my industry know-how to the emerging economies, my competitors will do, so let me do it before the others do it. So there are externalities among the firms. And this way, technology was transferred to the emerging economies. And this actually helped, millions of people to get out of poverty. So the goods export-led development strategy was essentially one way, was the only growth strategy which really worked and helped us to, bring millions of people out of poverty. Of course, now we have a different world. We move into a technological protectionism. So we try to protect technology rather than giving it away through the competitive behavior across the firms. And that leads also to a huge wave of fragmentation. The global economy is fragmented between the West and the emerging economies and China. Now, the question is essentially what are the big components once you have this more strategic behavior, how important are scale effects? If you think about it, of course, China these days is as big in numbers of people as compared to in the 1980s, the whole world was, the Western world was. So it's a huge economy on its own. So and we shared a lot of this technology, so the comparative advantage is actually less relevant. So perhaps the scale effects are the primary drivers. In this case, China is very large, so it might win because there's huge scale effects. So we have to think about scale effects and network effects. These are all different forms of scale effects. And also, how does it compare to developing some overcapacities? Are there natural monopolies? And you want to be the first one, develop a natural monopoly, but once you're the first one, second movers have less incentives to innovate. In particular, it's very prominent in the green technology, where it's a big debate, the externalities, environmental externalities, and also innovation externalities, which would argue for cases where you subsidize big time in order to build up capacities, to production capacities, and you might actually build up strategic overcapacities in order to exploit the scale effects. And some examples, so if you look at the solar industry, so Germany in the 2000s, subsidized the solar industry big time to build up a solar industry, but then it moved on to China because it was not cost competitive enough. And then essentially all the subsidies which are still paid today actually benefit the rest of the world by having cheaper solar power or more scale efficient solar powers. And this is actually, from a world perspective, it's a benefit, but of course it's paid primarily by the German users of electricity. Similarly, China is building up a huge capacity on electric EVs, electric vehicles, and the question is just a distortion of the trade, international trade, or is it just externalities, environmental and innovation externalities they're moving ahead? Now, this all leads to industrial policy. These are big industrial policy questions, and industrial policy, which we discussed last week with Ernest Lu, is in the vogue again. Everybody wants to do industrial policy, and it leads to a tit-for-tat relationship where, you do some industrial measures, protectionist measures, and other countries will respond to that, and that undermines international globalization. And will this undermine, these benefits we had now for decades to bring millions of people out of poverty? And will it be the other questions? Will it be the case that goods trade will be infected by industrial policy because industrial policy is mostly about manufacturing, but service trade will escape this global fragmentation? So if you just look at the numbers of trade restrictions in the recent years, so you can see for the goods, that's the red bars, and for the services, you also see increasing number of trade restrictions coming up. And the investments, you see the FDIC and FDI investments as well. So this is taken for some figure from IMF data. Now, a main thing is resilience and geoeconomics. So in the strategic setting, when you don't behave competitively, but every country behaves strategically, you want to avoid, for geopolitical reasons, you want to avoid choke points, that others can set up choke points for you and essentially extract some bargaining benefits from you. And one way to achieve that, besides, reshoring, friendshoring, is essentially multi-sourcing. And you want to outsource your input providers to multiple suppliers, and there are different aspects how you can do that. From a risk perspective, you want to outsource to different players which have very low correlation. So that's when you do some risk management. But if you have a resilience management, it's much more that you would like to outsource to players which can scale up and can adapt very easily. So this way, when one player is trying to strategically act against you or simply fails, you can scale up some other supplier very easily. So there's a trade-off between cost efficiency and resilience. Resilience would really argue for multi-sourcing and focusing on this adaptability and the scaling up very easily. And resilience is particularly important in transition phases because we move to new outcomes. We move essentially from goods to service trades. Also, AI will play a role in that. And we also, in terms of moving this global fragmentation, that actually also is a huge transition we are moving to. So with this few remarks, I would like to go to the questions you answered very gratefully. I'm very happy that you answered them. And let's see what you say. Will trade in services be the dominant part in international commerce in 2040? Yes or no? And the answer was 76% yes and 24% no. So more than 2/3 said services is the way in international arrangements. Then the sub-question is that will instant translation software and AI lead to an explosion of service trades? Yes or no, because there are different time zones, there are cultural differences, which are also important, not only the language. And the answer for that was 66% to 34%. Okay. Now, the third question is manufacturing export-led growth still a workable strategy, or is it dead? Are we moving to some other, export-led some strategy or some other growth strategies? And is it still working? And people think 70% think it's still working, and 30% think it's not working anymore. The fourth question is, will national industrial policies destroy globalization? A, in goods trade, 40%, in service trade, 2%. No, it will not destroy globalization, 58%. The fifth question is, do environmental externalities and scale effects justify strategic overcapacity in solar, for example, in solar and EV market? Yes, say 45%, no, 55%. So it's half-half. And the sixth question is, does resilience require state interventions or government interventions? And actually 89% thought yes, only 11% thought no. Okay, so with these poll questions and some stimulation from the poll questions, we open up the floor, the floor to Richard, who will tell us everything, what's happening, what's the big shift in globalization going on at the moment. And he is one of the leading experts answering these questions. Thanks again, Richard, for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for that excellent introduction and kind words, and the polls, which were really interesting to see what was going on with that. What I want to do today is, as you say, go through the big shifts. But as you'll see on my screen, I've subtly changed the title to the third big shift in globalization. I have been banging on this since I wrote a paper with Philippe Martin in 1999 called Globalization, the two waves of globalization. And since then, I've been doing a lot more. So I'm gonna start a little bit with that. Then I'm gonna run through a bunch of facts, which I hope will at least modify somewhat some of people's beliefs. And then I'm gonna talk about so what, and that's going forward. I'm not gonna get to the resilience or the industrial policy, but hopefully we can get to that in the, the Q&A. So can you see my screen now, right? Okay, good. Okay, so let's get started. Oops, wait, how do I go here? Okay, there. So this is, by my reckoning, the third big shift in globalization. And the first two were starting in 1820. And the way I think about this is what I call the three cascading constraints perspective on globalization, which is a framework I've been thinking about and writing about since 2006. And in particular, in my 2016 book, I write it up at great length. And in that three cascading constraints, I explain how globalization is really arbitrage and stuff. But what's being arbitraged is constrained by costs of moving different things. And as the cost of moving different things change, the nature of globalization and the impact of it changes. So here's the basic idea. Let me see if I can. Okay. So here you can see the world share of incomes from year 1000 up until fairly recently, 2014. And for most of human history, there was a great stagnation where India and China had about half the world's GDP because they had about half the world's population and everybody was more or less the same per capita income. Then when globalization started in 1820, there was the great divergence. That's when the rich countries got rich and the G7 had about 2/3 of all world income at that time. From 1990, there was a huge shift in globalization, which I called the Great Convergence, or what I call the Great Convergence. And the G7 share started plummeting, and it still continued to go. And India and China is continuing to soar. So the idea about that is that for the 1820 to 1990 period was primarily falling trade costs, the cost of trading goods, but not the cost of communication and not the cost of face-to-face. So what was arbitraged was goods. From 1999, information and communication technology got good enough to make it feasible to offshore factory stages. So, before it was unthinkable to make the tails of a business jet in the middle of Mexico and the rest up in Quebec. But once you had ICT, you could coordinate it. So ICT enabled fragmentation and the large wage differences drove it. And as you mentioned, in order to make sure everything worked together, the G7 firms offshored their technology, but only to the companies and countries that they were offshoring to. Now, in my 2016 book, I use this three cascading constraint to predict that there will be another big change where trade in services or trade in labor services rises. And so there wasn't enough data on it back then, but recently there's been more data, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So this is a third big shift. So when one way of putting it is the first shift is when goods cross borders. The second was when factories started crossing borders. And the one we're seeing now is when offices are crossing borders. So that's the three cascading constraints idea. Okay, so I'm going to go through the facts reasonably quickly, but you can see down here my Twitter handles there, and I've uploaded all the charts, not all the slides, but all the charts to the Twitter handles. So if you want to have a little more quality time with one of them while I'm going on with the others, just go to the Twitter feed and you can see whatever you want. Okay, let's get started here. The first fact is that goods trade peaked. So what we have here is the ratio of world trade in goods, all goods, as a share of world GDP. And I've put since we have indices, I've put the whole thing to 100 in 2015. So you see this first phase where before the second unbundling started, before the second phase started, from the mid-1980s, you get this very rapid rise in world trade in goods. And a lot of that is two-way trade in parts and components going across in what eventually became called as global value chains. Starting in 2008, that stopped and it's never really reversed. So they're kind of on a gentle decline. I've written a number of things which show that that's a false peak in the sense that some countries, if you take the biggest traders, some of them peaked before, especially China, and a number of them peaked quite late afterwards. And some of them, like the European Union, haven't peaked. But when you combine them all together, it looks like this nice, neat peak. And it comes in 2008, which is a convenient because of the global financial crisis. So whatever is false or not false, it's absolutely clear that trade in goods is not doing now what it was doing in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So that's the first thing. Global goods trade peaked. The second one, let me see if I can get here, is that the manufacturing supply chains are defragmenting since 2012. There's a couple interesting things here. First of all, it's 2012. And most people are thinking about defragmentation and deglobalization starting much later. So what is fragmentation? So this graph shows the manufacturing intermediate production over total production in manufactured goods. So total production consists of intermediates and finals, but you use the intermediates to make the finals. So in GDP, you don't count the intermediates, but in terms of gross production, you do. And to some extent, the share of production, gross production that goes to intermediates is giving you a measure of how long and how dense the supply chains are all over the world. And this doesn't distinguish between domestic intermediates and foreign intermediates. So since 2012, supply chains are getting shorter and or less dense basically everywhere. And it's not a huge shift, but from 2012 of 72% down to 2020 of 70%. But again, you can see it's a radical change from what was happening when the second unbundling started in the late 90s, and this big ramp up in fragmentation all over the world happened. The next fact is, manufacturing supply chains are localizing since 2004. And again, note how early that is compared to what the narrative you read about in your news feeds every day. And a lot of that has to do with China. We'll talk about that in a second. But what this line is showing is manufactured intermediate imports worldwide over total intermediate usage worldwide. Now I can get these from the TIVA database. It's basically a picture of the entire world economy, OECD TIVA database. Now what we see
Richard,
is
what
that
is usage? What are intermediate usage?
So gross production, you need intermediate goods in order to produce final goods. And so what this is looking at, of all the intermediate goods you need to produce the final goods, what share of them is imported? International. So it's a little bit like an openness ratio, but limited to intermediate goods. So it's essentially how globalized are world supply chains overall. Now, that has been gently declining since 2004. And interestingly enough, it's almost back to where it was in the 1990s when this whole unbundling thing started. So that's reversed. As we'll see, China makes a big role there. Okay, next.
But can I just ask, so there's all this argument that we essentially, instead of importing from China, we import now from Vietnam, and China exports to Vietnam, and we import it from Vietnam or Mexico.
So that's definitely going on, but that's not what's here. So this is the entire world's imports of intermediates from anywhere over the entire world's usage of it. So whether it shifts from China to Vietnam, it's not going to affect, except for China and Vietnam.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's thank you for clarifying that. It's not I call it, well, anyways, it's essentially openness in intermediate goods. So the next fact is the G7 deindustrialized and 6 emerging economies industrialized. The rest of the world didn't change much. So this is using UNITA data, so it's GDP rather than gross output as before. And the blue line there is the G7. And you see, as late as 1999, the G7 accounted for 2/3 of all world trade GDP in manufactured goods. And that declined down to 37% by 2020. The entire decline of the G7 was taken up by 6 industrialized emerging economies, which are China, India, Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, and Brazil in order of rise. The whole rest of the world didn't change much at all. So what this is showing, and I've argued in my 2016 book, Markus, did I mention I have a book?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Good.
In the beginning.
So these countries are where those supply chains and where the offshoring of technology went to at first. And some countries like China managed to turn it into a self-sustaining industrialization, but some of them are still mainly using imported technology for it. But in any case, the point is that the emerging market miracle, at least in manufacturing, only went where the G7 firms went. It wasn't something like changing technology floating through the air in a general way. It was very specific, very directed. Okay, the next one set of facts is China dominates manufacturing now. And I'd like to stress very much that you cannot talk about globalization, especially manufacturing, without special casing China, because it's so dominant. So what you see on the right here is the share of percent of manufacturing, share of world gross output. So we're back to gross output, which is total business turnover, basically. And I'm using the TIVA data set, so it only goes from 95 to 2020. China started at about 5% of world output. In the late 90s, it surpassed Japan. In the early 2000s, it passed Germany. In the late 2000s, it passed the US share of global. And since then, it's more than doubled its share of world output. If you see on the right, you can see that China's output is now larger than the next 9 countries put together. It is the world's sole manufacturing superpower. This is something that's not quite as well recognized as it probably should be, because when people talk about decoupling or localizing supply chains, I don't think they really understand that 35% of world production and manufacturing is in China, and it will not be easy to reproduce that sort of stuff. So that's a first point. Now, let me show you a little bit about the dominance or importance of China. So let me revisit the supply chain fragmentation, which is the whole world, domestic and foreign, put together. That blue line is what the line we saw before. The orange line is the line without China. And you can see that the defragmentation has been much stronger if you take China out. And that's because China is starting to become the world's OPEC of industrial inputs. They're doing so much of it. But if you take out China, there's been a lot of defragmentation, lot less use of intermediate goods in making final goods. And I'll argue that that's technologically based, or at least one of the hypotheses. So on the right, you see manufacturing intermediate imports over total intermediate usage. The blue line is the one we saw before is going down. If you take China out, it's still going up. So what we see is that this imported intermediate is increasing for most countries, but not China. China is essentially replacing its imported intermediates with domestic production. It's successfully doing import substitution, if you like to use those kinds of terms. Also, there's what you might call a China paradox. China is closing as it dominates. And that's what some people don't get their mind around it. People have the idea that China is opening up, export-led growth, all that. That's not true at all. So if the first chart on the left here, this is goods exports, total goods exports as a percentage of production for the total economy. And you can see China rose up to 2005, that's their openness ratio, and has been falling since. And now it's starting to converge to the US level, which is very low as well. But that's because it's becoming a mega economy, and mega economies mostly buy from themselves. They're the own best customer. So China, since 2005, is becoming less dependent on exports. And that's also true in manufacturing. So how can it be that they're closing off, but still dominating the world? And the right chart shows you that it's just a question of numerator and denominator. The green chart, the green line shows share of world production that China is responsible for too. And we saw that before, up to 35%. The orange line is the share of world exports. That we haven't seen that before, but you see it's rising quite rapidly. That's why everybody thinks Chinese exports are growing so quick, because they are. But the green line's rising much faster than the orange line, so the ratio is actually falling. So China is turning inward when it comes to manufacturing, but it's still dominating world trade and production. Just to give you an idea of how dominant it is in supply chains, this comes from the Brookings paper I did recently with Rebecca Freeman and Angelos Theodorkopoulos. So this is using a measure which we call FPAM, which is foreign production exposure on the import side. And it's the share of all US imports, the red line, that come from China, including all the imports that are into the imports of other countries. So the roundabout trade, like if China sells intermediates to Germany and Germany sells intermediates to the US, this measure counts all that stuff, not just directly. And you can see that US reliance on China has been rising pretty rapidly. It's quadrupled over this period. China's reliance on the US, not so much. It's actually declining. And if you look at Germany, which is another industrial giant, same thing. Japan, same thing. And if we did it, and we do in the paper, for all the G7, it all looks like this, even more extreme. So there is an extreme asymmetry of reliance on supply chains, which is another reason why decoupling, full decoupling, is just a fantasy, at least for the next decade or so, in my view. So,
but you're saying that China itself decoupled itself, in a sense.
Well, so China is becoming like the US. So yes. If you look back at this chart, this is the US export of goods as a percent of gross production. It's quite low because it's a mega economy. Yes. And China is converging to what the US is. So actually China is normalizing in terms of openness ratio. It's what you expect when you have a very large economy. Japan is also that. Germany is a little bit different. These are the four big manufacturers because it's in the European Union. And so much of what would naturally be in US part of one country, different states, it counts as international trade. But for example, if I took only extra EU trade of Germany, it would look more like the Japan of the US, way down there. So, I mean, another startling fact about this is the world is actually not very open when it comes to manufacturing. It seems that way, but most of the big countries are their own best customers. Okay, now I'd like to move on to world services. World service exports didn't peak or slow, and you mentioned this. So I've put the values to 100 in 2008. And these are just values. They're not ratios or anything. It's just the value of trade. And here for manufacturers exports, you can see they go up. But after 2008, the growth rate flattened significantly. The FDI trend, this is from a new report that UNCTAD came out with a couple of weeks ago, it also flattened out. But the ICT-enabled services, which are services that go over electronic means, has not slowed down. It's rising at the same rate as it did during the boom years of the 90s and 2000. No sign of slowing down. Slight hiccup at 2008, but it has not slowed down. So this is what I think you started with, is service trade is booming, manufacturing is slowing. So what is happening with globalization is not that it's ending, it's just evolving. But of course, manufacturing is about 80% of world trade now, and services is only about 25%. Anyways, because services are growing faster than manufacturing, we get the ratios changing. So globalization is still booming in services. The left chart shows world service exports as a percent of GDP. And you can see that's been rising since the mid 80s. And it started down in 7% in 1980, and now it's up to 13%. And you do not see globalization or deglobalization or peaking in that services. And since you do see it in goods, the ratio of world services trade as a percent of total trade has been rising, and especially sharply since 2010, which I would ascribe to the increase of what I call the third unbundling, as the cost of face-to-face lowered and offices started crossing borders. This thing took off. And that's my projection, is that that's going to continue going there. Okay. The next point is that ICT-enabled services exports, the developing world share is low, but growing faster. So on the left chart here, you see the developed countries still dominate modern service exports, just like they did in manufacturing back in the 90s. China is surprisingly high. India is 5%. And this is all the rest of the developing countries. But on the right chart, you'll see that developed countries are growing slower in this than emerging economies. So I've put it together at 2016, which is when they kind of started to diverge. And you can see since then, the developed countries have seen 41%, the developing countries 60%, and that divergence increases. And it's even stronger for certain subfields, which are very much like offices crossing borders. Okay, so here's an example of that. So this is for information communication services, which is the dashed lines. Orange is the emerging economies, blue is the developed countries, and you can see that it's going up much faster. It was put to 195, and now it's up to 900 for the developing countries, only about 600 for the rich countries. Same thing for tech, professional, technical, and administrative services. Those are the solid lines. Very big divergences between the growth. So that's the idea, is that much of this growth in services will be favoring emerging markets. Okay, let's see. So manufacturing export-led growth is dying. Service export-led growth is happening. That's the facts I want to document in the next 2 slides. So let me just say that I've been banging on about service export-led growth for a long time, but there's a lot of people in the World Bank and the OECD who've been going on it for a lot longer. So I'm not the only one doing this by any means. So this is from the right chart, is from a very good World Bank report with the somewhat laconic title, "At Your Service, ? The Promise of Service-Led Development" by Niagara, Halley, Ward, Brunnermeier, and Davis. I think I at least got one of those names correct. But anyways, came out in 2021. The fact is that low and middle income workers are leaving the farm for the service jobs, not the manufacturing jobs. It is not like you learned in graduate school where they go from the farms to the factories, the country industrialized, and then you go from the factories to the offices. That's not the way it's working. They're going straight from the farm into service sector of a variety of types. So that's important to note, that whether coulda, shoulda, woulda, they aren't moving into industry as a fact. And that's been going on for a long time. The fact in the right chart addresses one of the major criticisms of service export-led development, is that service jobs don't have as high of TFP growth, or at least that's what they say. But that's not true in most low and middle income countries. So the standard impression we have, where the yellow, which is industry TFP, and blue, which is service TFP, we say that the yellow is higher than the blue. That's true in high income countries. It's true in East Asia and the Pacific, and it's true in the emerging markets in Central Europe and Central Asia. But the rest of the world is not true. In Latin America and the Caribbean, they're even. In Middle East and North Africa, services is higher substantially. In South Asia, it's higher in services, and in the sub-Saharan Africa, it's higher in services. Now, I believe that at least part of that is because China has become so dominant in manufacturing that exporting manufacturing goods has not been a good business for anybody who's not in one of these global value chains, which means people who are not in East Asia or Central Europe or Central America. So that's worthwhile saying, that service export-led growth is not suffering from the TFP bias outside of a handful of countries. Okay.
What's the argument that sometimes it's made that it's much more difficult for people who are less well educated to jump to services right away? It's much easier to be part of a manufacturing process. You can just start next day and start working. While for services, you have to go through the education.
No, that's so. For exporting, I'm not sure it's true. Certainly for middle class and middle income countries, exporting services might be easier. It's essentially working from home when home's abroad. Mm-hmm. But on the factory side with low educated people, I think that's absolutely true. And that's in this report from the World Bank. They list the characteristics of manufacturing export-led growth that we all love. And then they compare it to services. But the reality is it's not possible. And I'll show you it's not happening. So coulda, shoulda, woulda, you can't. So this, even Danny Roderick, who's the ultimate manufacturing export-led guy, has jumped on the service-led development bandwagon. And his argument is, faute de mieux. You can't do anything else. It's the best option available. So get used to it. Let's try and make it work. So it's a very good point, Markus. But it's, I mean, if you ask me, if we could go back to export manufacturing-led growth, it could be a great idea. We just can't. In large part because China already has. And another part is because manufacturing as a whole is becoming localized and defragmented, so that some of the good things that worked in the 90s don't work anymore. Okay, so let me see. I forgot to start my timer. So am I half hour in now?
Okay.
So
you can run a little bit over.
Okay, 2.5 hours left. Thanks. That's good. You get my jokes. I really like that, Markus. That's great. Okay, so here we go. The next fact, export-led growth, manufacturing versus services. Barely surviving versus fully thriving. You can see I've been using ChatGPT to get snappy phrases. So what I'm going to do is compare 1995 to 2008 and 2008 to 2020. And the top chart there shows manufacturing export-led growth. What number of countries, the share of countries that are experiencing manufacturing export-led growth. So let me define that. There is actually, if you look on the internet, you cannot find a great definition of export-led growth. So I made one up. I say, if the value-added content of the exports is growing faster than GDP as a whole, then you could at least make an argument that it's the export value-added growth that's leading the overall GDP. And if it were the other way around, you need a really complicated story to see how exports were doing it. Now, the point is from 95 to 2008, about 60% of the lower middle income countries who are in this TIVA database were doing it. About 80% of the 16 upper middle countries were doing it, and about half the high income. But I'm going to leave the high income aside. You can see it's 43 high income countries because it's the OECD database, and these are less represented. Now, if you look what happens after 2008, we get a radically different picture. It's pretty rare that countries are experiencing manufacturing export-led growth, down around 10–15%. Now, if you go to the bottom, we're going to do the same exercise, but for service export-led growth as a percentage of the income category. And you see here the ordering is exactly the opposite. You go from lower in the first phase to higher in the second phase, and now the scales aren't the same. Right now, 60% of the low middle income countries are doing it, and 85% of the upper middle income countries are doing it. So de facto, people have switched from manufacturing export-led growth to service export-led growth. Deal with it. That's what's happening. Our challenge, I think, is how to turn that into something that's good for the broader society and inside these countries and more broadly. That's what I want to talk about next. Okay, so I won't recap. So why? Why did these things happen? In particular, in my 2016 book, I have a chapter of explaining the defragmentation, predicting and explaining the defragmentation and the localization. And I want to go through that logic. So this has not been tested. I'm hoping somebody who has more patience and better tools than me will actually go out and see if this hypothesis is correct. But the logic is compelling, or at least I've convinced myself, but then again, it's my model. So what does that mean? Okay, two hypotheses or mechanisms. I'm going to claim that IT, information technology, is reducing fragmentation. So the supply chains are retracting because of IT. Second one is that automation is localizing manufacturing. So let me go through that logic. So the first one, let's do this background. I developed this task, occupation, stages, and products to look at the fragmentation. So at the bottom here, you have the whole product. The product is made in a couple different stages. Then the stages have different occupations, and each occupation has a number of tasks. So how many tasks you put per occupation, how many occupations you put per stage, how many stages you have, that's all endogenous. And the more fragmented it is, the more trade and intermediate goods you're going to get. So there's a framework for looking that I believe, and it's inspired by Bloom, Garciano, Sudan, and Van Rees paper, where they have communication technology, CT, and information technology, which is IT. Now, CT is just communication. IT is basically how good the machines are. In particular, what range of task can a machine do? So what you have here is an endogenous determination of, say, the number of stages for a production process, where the marginal cost of fragmentation goes up because it's more difficult to coordinate stages when there's more of them. Everybody has to coordinate with everybody. So the marginal cost of adding a stage rises as the number of stages rises, and the marginal benefit declines because the benefit of having the stages is you get to specialize, and therefore you get better at different things. But as you get really specialized, the marginal benefit of the next stage goes down. So there's a point N1 where you're in equilibrium. That's you decide how fragmented the thing should be. Now, if you get better communication technology, you get more fragmented without change in information technology. If you get better IT without changing the CT, you get defragmentation. And I think up to the 2000s, the CT led to more fragmentation, both within countries and across countries. And subsequently, the automation is leading to fewer stages of production, both within countries and across countries. So that's a hypothesis. Now, what I want to talk about is localization. So recall that tradability by sector, this kind of Dornbusch-Fisher-Samuelson diagram, where we have sectors along the bottom here and proportional cost in, say, the South and the North. And the slope is due to the unit labor cost differences. Here, wages are fixed. And what you get is a trade cost band. So not all of these goods will be traded because over here, the North has a comparative advantage and actually exports. Down here, South does. But in between, each is most competitive in their own market, so it becomes non-traded. Now, the trick here is that automation and manufacturing are related to this tradability. So if we assume a very simple unit cost function where the cost of producing it is the wage times the unit labor input coefficient plus some traded goods, which, to simplify, cost the same in the North and the South. Could be oil or whatever. So the cost difference when you do your little algebra between the North and the South as a percentage of the North is labor cost share times 1 minus this intrinsic comparative advantage in labor. Now, the point is that labor cost share is driven down by automation. So the difference between the cost in the North and the South is driven down by automation. So to look at it in the diagram, you have the original slope like this, and as labor cost share comes down, comparative advantage of roads and more of the goods become non-traded. So essentially, as manufacturing becomes not, we eliminate the labor from manufacturing, we will eliminate comparative advantage. And why bother sending it all around the world when the machines cost more or less the same everywhere? And you'll see examples of things like T-shirts being reshored to Germany or whatever, because everything's done by the machine anyway, so labor costs don't matter. So that's a hypothesis. I've been talking about this one for a long time, and I recently tried to look at some data, and I'm not sure it works. Because this might, anyways, we'll talk about that in Q&A if you want. But hopefully some smart, tooled up, very patient person might be able to look at that. Okay,
but
the opposite is true for services.
The same across all the different products?
Sorry?
The theta L is the same across all products?
The L, what you mean, this thing?
Oh, the theta.
Yeah, no, this is definitely an abstraction. I'm simplifying to clarify. But the general point is that since you can only really get a comparative advantage on non-traded things,
yes, and
the main non-traded things is labor, and all the automation is taking the labor out all over the world, there's a tendency to trade less. I'm just simplifying. I'm doing like a Helpman-Krugman kind of model or something like that.
But the same you could make for services too, if we replace labor with some artificial intelligence.
Well, let's
specific to goods, in a sense.
That's the next slide. So I want to make the argument that services are very labor intensive. And there is now, especially with ChatGPT, some possibility of substitution. But even if you're using ChatGPT, it's still going to be relatively labor. So I here take the opposite abstraction, that there's no automation elimination of labor. And I think that's Okay. But the digital technology is lowering the cost of trading services internationally and radically fast. So what we're seeing is more types of services traded, but and so eventually the automation may get rid of that as well. But that's my hypothesis. That's why I explained the defragmentation and the localization is something that started way before geopolitics got going, and in China started in the 2000s. So I think it's a technological trend. Just as an aside, I think a number of these reports that purportedly show that it's geopolitical tensions that's leading to less trade, I think they're not controlling for these longer term trends, and especially with China, because that's what China is turning in on itself and has been since 2006, totally apart from geopolitics. So I'd just say that en passant. Okay.
But are you arguing that geopolitics plays no role at all, or do you think your forces are more prominent than the geopolitical forces?
No, I think people are ascribing all the change to geopolitics when that's essentially a problem of missing variables. I don't think they have this trend in there. When you put in the gravity equation, for instance, you're assuming all those elasticities stay the same.
You make some normative statements as well, because it's nothing. So these trends you're describing, there's nothing bad about them, I guess.
That's right. That's right. It's essentially what's going to happen is that everybody will make their own manufacturing locally or regionally. Ultimately, think about the extreme of 3D printing. It's a fantasy, but if everything was done by 3D printing, there'd be absolutely no reason to make stuff in China and sell it in Europe, because the machines and the materials, it all costs the same everywhere. So it's not a normative statement. And also, I mean, that's a good point. I'm glad you made that. Is deglobalization may be a sign of efficiency, not inefficiency. So the idea that more trade, more efficiency, that's true if you don't take account of these kinds of trends. Okay. So now the conjecture is the future of trade is services, especially intermediate services. Now, I'm glad to hear the poll. Everybody agrees. 2/3 of the people already agreed with that statement, which is wonderful. I've been banging on this forever, and it goes from incredulous to whatever. Anyways, I could tell lots of stories, but I won't. I have the feeling, Markus, it's just you and me talking, but I guess there's quite a few people listening, so I should cut out the chit chat. Anyways, so this is the conjecture. Let me just clarify intermediate goods. Most people, when they think about trade in services, they're thinking about trade in final services, because that's what we as consumers see. But much of the trade in services is intermediate. In other words, business to business, not business to consumer. So let me go on with this argument. What are intermediate services? Intermediate services are B2B services, all the service tasks done in service sector, manufacturing sector, and private sector that are not sold to customers. For example, tasks done by occupations like bookkeepers, forensic accountants, CV screeners, administrative assistants. You can read the list faster than I can list it, but basically it's all the back office stuff. And that is actually a huge amount of work in all the advanced economies. Okay, so here's the argument, 4 facts and a conclusion. And I'm going to go through the facts if I have a little time, but I'm just going to assert the argument and then try and provide some charts to show that the facts are true. First, barriers to services trade are much higher than barriers to good trade, often 2 or 3 orders of magnitude higher. 2, most barriers to trade in intermediate services are technologically linked, not policy linked. That will require a little discussion, but it's definitely true. Digitech is lowering barriers to international services at an explosive pace, and COVID is forcing the adjustment. So since the barriers are technological and the barriers are coming down due to digital trade, it's an exponential thing. So let's say now the trade barriers have a tariff equivalent of 500%. Next year, in 2 years, it's 250. After that, and you see how it goes. This thing is liberalizing at a pace which is astounding. And I think it's one of the reasons it's growing so fast. The fourth is demand in rich nations is huge. I'll show you some figures. About 1/3 of all gross spending in rich countries is on these intermediate services. And if any of you run a center, like I know you do, Markus, if you think about where your budget goes to, a large part of your budget is going to these intermediate services. The second point is the capacity is huge in emerging markets because they're already doing these things for themselves. They have bookkeepers and accountants and copy editors and stuff like that. There's a lot of them, and I'll show you some numbers.
But to what extent is automation, you argue it lowers the transaction costs towards, going abroad, but I could also lower the transaction that it's just automated by robots.
That's true. So the question you're asking is AI and RI, which I call remote intelligence, are those complements or substitutes?
Yes, exactly.
And I published an article with Toshi Okubo in the World Economy recently, where we had a large data set, a worker level data set in Japan, which we luckily started gathering before COVID and after COVID. And we looked for whether there was positive or negative correlation. So there was investment by the companies in technology that made remote work easier and that automated work. And it turned out the ones who did the most rework also invested in the AI, which was, so it looks like they're complements, not, a lot of that AI was in management kind of stuff. So that's possible. But we don't know. It could go either way. Certainly, when it comes to chatbots and call centers in the Philippines, they are definitely substitutes. I'll show you something. I have some graphs at the end where we can look at this, what I call the globotics quadrant. But anyways, let me finish there. Ergo, intermediate service trade will grow much faster than goods trade for the foreseeable future, as they have since the mid-2000s. So let me just give you a couple, flesh out these facts if I have a few minutes. These are the economic studies which show that the barriers for services are higher than goods based on gravity equation estimates. The barriers are mostly technological. So most service barriers are regulatory, not tariffs. It's actually quite hard to tax trade and services. And the OECD's Service Trade Restrictive Index shows regulations for final services like medicine, dentistry, architecture. And they are very, very high. But there's almost no regulation on intermediate services like back office jobs, copy editing, screening. So a Swiss architect, for example, has to sign all the plans that go for Swiss buildings, but that Swiss architect can get the stairway blocks designed in India. And it's only on her to quality check. There are no regulations in Switzerland about using offshore people to design bits and pieces. And the same thing's true in finance and insurance and all these other things. So by default, these things weren't protected. The political economy forces led to protection of the final services. They were organized, but the people who are selling the final services have an incentive to get their inputs cheaper. So there's no political economy push for putting up barriers against these intermediate goods services. At least that's my interpretation.
But so that's if going a little bit forward looking right now, there might not be big barriers, but once this gets more on the forefront and more prominent, trade unions might argue, and there might be some political push from that side to put some protections on.
It's possible, but it's also another, and this also goes to the geopolitics things. It's funny, it's very hard to stop trade and services. And it's exactly the same thing for value-added tax. It's very hard to tax services, especially exports. And until fairly recently, most countries just didn't bother putting a value-added tax on services. Now they do, but they don't zero rate the exports because they don't know how much has been collected. It's hard to know where stuff is made. So when you don't know where it's made, what do rules of origin look like? How do you tax it? How do you know what's in an email? You could have $1 million report in an email done by somebody else. How would you know that unless you have a Chinese firewall? So I think when you get around thinking about it, it's hard to do. And as you may know, the WTO has a moratorium on putting tariffs on digital transmissions. And that moratorium has continued in part because nobody's figured out how to do it. And the countries who want to do it, they just put a value-added tax on things like Netflix and YouTube and stuff like that. And they get the service provider to collect the tax. But it's very difficult. And the same thing with geopolitics. It's pretty hard to shut it down unless you want to go all the way to the Chinese firewall. Fact 3, digital technology is lowering the barriers to intermediates at an explosive pace. We don't have to talk about that because, for example, you and I are trading services right now, and it's pretty smooth, and it'll get smoother as things go. The next point I want to make is machine translation is melting language barriers. And there's some research that shows, for example, when eBay started translating all the posts into Spanish, the sales to all the Spanish countries went up. And there's lots and lots of other studies. The interesting thing is that simultaneous speech translation is going to become a thing because of machine learning very soon. And I think that will revolutionize things, as I'll push. So here it is, simultaneous speech translation. It's instant speech translation. Markus, I know you and many of the audience will have done painful sequential translation in conferences where you talk one or two sentences and then you stop and the translator says, and then you go again. It's very painful. But simultaneous, there's a few humans in this world who can listen in one ear in Spanish and speak in English in the other. It's a fantastic thing, but it is possible to do. Now they're doing that. This is the beta version of it. It's called Time Kettle, where this guy will be wearing an ear piece here. He's speaking Spanish. This guy's hearing him in French with this earpiece while they're talking with a slight delay. So that may be done by the end of this year or the end of next year, but definitely in the next couple of years, because all you need is a big data set, and they have those. So once that happens, the language barrier will go. So these millions of Chinese engineers will be speaking good enough English very soon. So the fact on the demand for intermediate services is huge in rich nations. So I did this for my Sintra paper, and you can see service intermediates into the service sector, 32%, manufacturing, 24%, primary, 28%. All the sectors use intermediate services. So overall, it's 30%. For manufactured intermediates, only 11%. So this 30% means there's a huge existing demand for it. Not all of it will go to foreigners, but there's a big demand. You do not have to create a market for this stuff like you might have to do for electric vehicles from Bangladesh or wherever. The supply of workers in emerging markets is pretty big. So here's China, the total jobs, of the total business services, 34% of the jobs are already in business services. In India, it's 19%. And if you break that down, a lot of it's travel and tourism, that gray area, but they have other business services, real estate, finance, information, and communication. So we're talking tens or hundreds of millions of people who do this already in India, China, and same thing all over. So the conclusion is that they will grow forever, or not forever for the mean. Now, those of you who have a PhD in astrophysics will figure out how I put that red arrow on there. The rest of you, I'll just tell you I drew it. That's my prediction of where it's going to go. And I think that's what I think we need to tune into, because it's really going to change the world. So how much more time should I take, Markus? I could go through service-led development or just go to Q&A. Might be more fun.
Perhaps we can, you can go a little bit on, but let me ask you a few more questions from the audience. So, Rohit Lamba, who wrote with Ragurajan a book for how India should develop going forward. And should it follow the Chinese way, or should it develop its own way, which is a little bit to some extent focusing on the service trades. But he's asking whether, services, intermediate services are very much embedded in manufacturing. Can we really separate these two things so clearly in this sense? What's your take? Or is it, some final service is not so clear? There are a lot of services which come with a particular manufactured product.
Absolutely embedded. So the first point is China is the second largest share gainer in the world on manufacturing, but they've done it mostly selling locally. They have the fastest growing large economy. And for instance, they're the largest producer of motorcycles in the world, but they don't really export them except to the neighboring countries. And so they have this advantage that they can have a huge manufacturing base on it without exporting. The trouble is once you start exporting, you run into China, and that's a difficult thing to do. Now, on the embedded services in the profession, that's called Mode 5 services. So it's services that go into manufactured goods and then get exported. So for India, I don't think that's a big deal, because what they're mostly exporting is things that these intermediate services that are sold to companies all over the world, like Tata Web Services and Infosys and all those guys and all the call centers. But in Europe, for example, part of the competitiveness of the trucks and the cars is the embedded service, including like observe in the trucks that Mercedes-Benz exports. There's a continuous connection which alerts people that this particular part might need to be replaced soon, so you should order in advance. And that kind of service makes things worth more. Tesla is the ultimate example. The car has a huge content of service to it, and a lot of its interest is the service in it, not the art. So that's called the servicification of manufacturing, and I think it's a big deal. So that's where we'd go with it. Oh, and then I just fall back on what I said before with manufacturing. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. India can't do it on manufacturing exports because China did it already. There's no way that India could grab 30% of world manufacturing and therefore export like they are. Yeah, let me just take that Indian example for one more thing. India had its export service miracle without signing a single free trade agreement because the market was already open. They faced almost no barriers to exporting that stuff. And that's so different than if they were trying to export, for instance, electric vehicles or pharmaceuticals or whatever. Okay, there's another question, or should I push on?
So let me throw in one more question, which from Martin Müller, and he argues that, can you tell us or convince us that, the goods export-led growth was working very well, that as service export-led growth will work the same way. It will also lead to the same convergence. Right. That's a conjecture, but can you give us some confidence that it will work as well as the goods export-led?
No, I never said it would work as well. It will work very, very differently.
Perhaps I oversold
this question. But the point is there is no option. I think the reason people are looking at service-led development is because manufacturing export-led development is not working anymore. And it's not working either for technological reasons or because China got there first. So it's a faute de mieux. And I'll talk about what we need to think about to make that right. But it most definitely is not a substitute. That's what the World Bank report in your service question mark is like saying, is this something wrong with this? Okay. So here's the talent tidal wave. I've been using ChatGPT generation, and I asked it to do a talent tidal wave, and here they are coming all over.
You didn't outsource your figures to the emerging economies?
Yeah, well, a lot of it will be coming from emerging economies. It might lead to a backlash in the rich countries eventually. And in my 2019 book, I have a chapter of what that backlash might look like. My guess is they'll use privacy regulations or health and safety regulations or taxation regulations to prevent this stuff if it really blows up. We'll see. Okay, more conjectures. Emerging market miracle will continue and spread, but be based on services, not commodities. So because time zones matter, I think South America, Latin America, and Africa will finally get in on the value chain thing. Because I think Latin America will be providing services for North America and Canada. And remember, language is no longer going to be an issue. And Africa will be providing the services for Europe, and Southeast Asia will be providing the services for Northeast Asia. That's a pure conjecture, of course. But it's also a couple points that are worthwhile. It's a different structural transformation. You have to think service-led export, not industry-led development. Think India, not China. And think service value chains, not global value chains. Now, I didn't say this before, but if you're exporting intermediate services, you've actually joined somebody's value chain. So I think as we go forward, the notion of service value chains, measuring them, seeing how effective they are and all that, that's going to flourish. I think there's a whole set of literature that needs to emerge to look at service value chains, not global value chains. So this is I repeated one slide, sorry about that. The first point here, though, we didn't see before, is that they're lower scale economies. In fact, right now, a lot of the export of services goes through what's called the business processing outsourcing service, where frequently it's relatively small and medium-sized enterprises who've become the back office for some other company somewhere else. And so I did a study on this in Bogota during COVID. And many of the firms have 10 to 20 people. They sit in Bogota and they do the back office for other people. So you do not need a large port facility. You don't have to build a factory. You don't have to create a market, and you don't have to join an industrial global value chain in which they check all your quality. It's much easier to get into, and there's lower scale economies and much lower agglomeration economies. So I think services are also easier to get into. And by the way, if you like these sorts of things, the consulting firm Actura has a BPO competitiveness index where they look through what countries need to do in order to jump on this export service value chain. And UNCTAD had a whole program for digitally enabled exports, they call that. Okay.
If you look at the size of the country, you think service-led benefits smaller countries more than manufacturing-led, because manufacturing or trade goods is very much.
Well, that's another point. I'm glad you said that. So one of there's three really big examples of countries who've done it on services. That's India, obviously, Philippines, and Costa Rica. Costa Rica being a tiny country. So they do lots of outsourcing for American companies. And because they, all you need is, it's one office at a time. It doesn't matter whether you have, you can make as many socks as somebody wants in a month or something. It's a smaller country. But I'll come to a second. Let me take this point. So this is a game for middle-income people in middle-income countries. It's not for poor people. You need steady electricity, you need steady internet access, and you need a device. And if you have those things in the world we live in today, you're middle class and almost surely live in a middle-income country. So this new type of export-led development is not like stepping on to exporting men's shirts or wool socks. It's not a step that everybody can take. So that's a problem, but deal with it. I think that's the reality. We just have to work around it or work with it. So I think one of the reasons it's easier, as you think about it, it's the same comparative advantages drove exports from emerging markets in industry. Telemigration, which is what I call foreign office offshoring, it allows emerging markets to export their comparative advantage directly. So before, the emerging markets comparative advantage, which was quality adjusted low-cost labor, you had to walk that labor into a farm or factory, produce goods, and then the goods were exported. Here, the low-cost labor, admittedly the middle class, are exporting directly. No ports, no railroads, no airports. They're doing it directly over the phone line. And more or less, instead of providing it to a local company in Bogota, they're providing it to a company in Miami, and thereby doubling or tripling what they can charge for it. Okay, so what we're going to need is new development strategy. We need to think cities, services, and training, not factories, industrial equipment, and technology. So think Bangalore's galore. I hope you like that. I gave a talk at the Indian Confederation of Industry telling them that they should be doing services. And this was the Confederation of Industry. I don't think it was entirely appreciated, but that's what it's going to look like. This development will look like Bangalore. It'll be city-based.
Why cities can't they do it from urban areas or from rural areas as well?
Well, yeah, okay, but wherever educated people can congregate, and you have steady electricity and good internet. So that is also in the cities. But it's not going to be industrial, free ports or industrial districts or things like that, like it was before, where you have a factory or an industrial district, and that's where the growth is coming from. This is going to be from the cities. So I think of, Nairobi, Kinshasa, Cape Town, Bogota, Buenos Aires. Those will have booming export services, which will create a middle class and create an upgrowth, like happened in Bangalore. And the trick then is to turn that localized growth into national growth. I think that's a trick. But in some sense, that's what rich countries do now. Almost all our growth.
Coastal regions versus non-coastal landlocked regions, you think it's more favorable to a landlocked? The big advantage of being on the coast goes away.
Yes, that unless you have a problem with your internet cable.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, but it comes through satellites in the future. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean Bangalore is not on the sea, so I don't think the coastal advantage matters so much. So here we go. New development theory is needed. So I looked around I said, okay, I was thinking through this, it's going to come through the cities. How does that spread? What does that look like? And as it turns out, there is no large level development theory that works on service exports. There's some that are based on exporting commodities and some based on manufacturing, mostly manufacturing, but not. My guess, it will probably be an extension of urban growth theory. Especially there's an interesting set of models, they're from the 20s, so call them models if you want, which is called this was his article, major factors in metropolitan growth and arrangement. What he has is what he calls base jobs. And base jobs are things where you export services to other parts of the country and attract in people and attract in spending. And that creates a process where, this sort of backward and forward linkages, but through services and not really production linkages, more like the person who's getting $5 an hour at a call center starts buying more dentist services and spending more money. And so it comes up. And what I think is interesting is in rich countries, this is how growth works now. Growth very often is led by urban development. And somehow or another, we haven't put that into a development theory. But we're going to have to, because I think that's what's going to go forward. And by the way, excuse me, I sound like I believe everything I say. And I understand that these are conjectures. That's why I use the word conjecture. But I have this terrible habit of that. Okay, new diagnostics are needed. So for instance, how do you judge comparative advantage in services? Service wage differences are not that hard to gather, but you need to adjust them for productivity differences, and those are hard to gather. So for example, do you have a comparative advantage in services or not? What are the determinants? We don't have those diagnostics, but we have them for industry and commodities. We just need to develop some more. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks for listening. This is my other book that I've been trying to advertise, The Globotics Upheaval. Globotics being a combination of globalization and robotics applied to the service sector, a word that everybody hated. I fell in love with it, but everybody hated it. I should have said digital technology and the future of world economy would have sold much more, but here we are anyways. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot, Richard. Let me just ask a few more questions and then we have to close it off. Can you say a few words about the implications for inequality within a country and across countries?
Yes.
Once we go to service.
So that's where my new speculation in my new book is going to be.
Sorry.
And the new book may actually be called The Great Equalizer.
Okay.
So and I'm focusing on Gen AI, not all AI. So one of the things that we've established about Gen AI is it levels up skills, reduces time, increases quality, but for the worst workers most. So that's the first order push, which suggests, like industrial mechanization from 1870 to 1970, it was raising up the productivity of the middle class, not the high class. And this, I think, will do the same. Now, across countries, it's also equalizing because essentially these apps are trained on G7 best workers, best practices, and then they get put in an app, which is dead easy to use, and it's instantly, perfectly, and endlessly reproducible. So the wisdom in the app will spread across the world. Mm-hmm. And people who think $10 an hour is a middle-class living will be able to take the advantage of an app which was trained on the behavior of G7 workers. So I think that Gen AI will make domestic and foreign workers better substitutes. And I think a lot of these software technologies will remove the accent, but remove some of the cultural biases. So personally, I see this as a part of the continuation of the service export-led boom.
What's about that the few big companies will control and get all the revenues and benefits from that? And it doesn't go, I mean, the workers might be equalized, but the big companies might.
And God bless them. I mean, think about Microsoft. They have virtual monopoly on MS Office, and no company in the world could work without MS Office. I mean, very few. And Microsoft is willing to give it to you a few $100s a year, and as long as they're willing to sell it and spread it to everybody, if the owners make quadrillions, who cares? It's not affecting inequality. So that's, I think, something to say. The other I wanted to say is I think in the end, this thing may end up like MS Office, that all companies will adopt it to stay competitive, not gain competitiveness. It'll essentially be raising the table stakes on quality and timeliness of service delivery, and everybody will do it, and there won't be that displacement of jobs. So this is my current thinking. It's not written up, and yeah.
So there are some questions which came up about infrastructure. The infrastructure for manufacturing and service is very different. I mean, you touched upon that. Do you think there is, for some emerging economies which put a lot of money into infrastructure in a particular direction and also got highly into debt, are disadvantaged compared to other countries which have not done it, and they can leapfrog essentially to the service focus?
Yeah. So let me take that. I don't have a perfect answer to it, but I am amazed at how people are still investing billions in port facilities and infrastructure, thinking that they're going to have export-led development. And I think those are wasted resources because it's just not going to happen. People, like the whole thing is like China is like one other. You get a data set and you get 50 developing countries and run some regressions, but that's not the way the world works. The world's completely changed for manufacturing. Commodities is a different story. We're always going to need commodities, and those really have a local comparative advantage. But in manufacturing, I think it's wasted resources. I think they're just dreaming. But mind you, there's not the imports substitution development has wasted a huge amount of resources. So it's just one more continuation of it. On the infrastructure, generally speaking, it's cheaper to do information infrastructure than it is like building railroads or something like that. So that's a good side. Yeah.
Let me go to, there are some countries which take a huge pride from being very manufacturing focused and don't shift to services. I'm, coming from Germany, I can say that, and also probably China has a similar attitude. What's your advice for countries which, have a huge manufacturing sector and they're challenged now, essentially? They haven't made a switch to the service sector, the transition to this concept. What would you do for these countries if you were to develop a game plan for, let's say, Germany?
Well, so remember, manufacturing is not going away. It's just going to get jobless and non-traded. Mm-hmm. So there will be plenty of manufacturing in Germany for the foreseeable future because you start ahead and it's all there. It's just not going to be part of the export bundle, or not nearly as much, going if these conjectures are correct. So I don't have a solution for everybody, but people do get stuck in yesterday's industries. It's happened many times. The South got stuck in textile and apparel, south of the U.S., for example, and that was very painful for them. So, but I think it's also important to say that manufacturing is not going away. We'll probably spend as much on manufactured goods as always. It'll just be locally produced and won't involve any jobs. So that's the downside.
Good. So let me close here. And I would like to thank you for giving this huge tour de force in globalization. And
provocation.
And we will actually figure out and we will learn whether your conjectures were right ultimately. But essentially, they are, of course, in any case, thought-provoking. And that's what we want here, to provoke everybody's thought, and so more people can think along these lines. And
great.
It was a great presentation. Thanks a lot. And thanks to everybody for being with us, and hope to see you soon.
See you.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.